one of the ones that's remiss.
The canvas is just linked in the chat. Tom did that for us.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. Let's see.
Minson, do you see the interpretation on your screen? I don't have access to it.
Yep. I see the interpretation. Yep.
Are you okay to start it?
Oh, okay. So
I learned how to do
English
it.
and Spanish. Just click start.
After Irene's explanation, then we'll.
Yes, Irene, if you like, go ahead in case anybody needs to make use of it. Whoops, we can't hear you in English.
Minson, I think you have to turn off the interpretation, and first Irene gives the introduction,
okay.
then you can turn it on.
So off.
Yeah.
It's the end. Okay.
Now we should be able to hear you, Irene.
Hello, this message will repeat in English afterwards. Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Irene y yo voy a ser la intérprete para ustedes el día de hoy. Si usted desea usar la interpretación, por favor, presione el icono del globo terráqueo que va a aparecer en sus pantallas. Puede ser en la esquina superior derecha o en la esquina inferior. Y con eso va a poder escucharme en español. Va a presionar usted Spanish o español para escucharme en español. Si usted desea hacer alguna pregunta, hágala en español sin pena. Yo estaré interpretándosela al inglés. And for those of you that will be listening in English, I will be offline, and if I need you to slow down a little bit or make a sign to you, I will appear again on screen, and I will make a few signs to make you or to call your attention, maybe asking you to slow down or to speak a little bit louder. So thank you very much, and we're ready to go.
Great. Thank you, Irene. Let's see. This is our third session. The Social Cooperative Academy is being brought to you by the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. This is an idea that Minsun and I have been talking about for a while, and we are now 3 sessions in. We are going to be making videos available to you participants of the first and second sessions, and we're also creating summaries and editing transcripts of those conversations, so that if you missed anything, you can go back and check it out, either watch the video or read the summary, whichever you like. Today, I think this is going to be very interesting because it's another example of how this is not really so much an academy as it is a group exploration of all of these topics. And before I jump in, Minsun, do you have anything you might want to say about the session today?
No, I'm good.
You're good. All right. So the session today is about the legal formation of corporate forms, this kind of dull-sounding thing that turns out to be incredibly important, particularly when you realize too late that you've chosen the wrong form. So that's why we've got Jerome Hughes here to help us think about that. And let me give you a little background on Jerome, our speaker. He is an assistant professor of law with the University of the District of Columbia's Community Development Law Clinic. Jerome has also worked for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development in private practice, and was also part of the U.S. Fulbright program in South Africa. His law degree is from Harvard Law School, and he also has an MS degree from MIT's Sloan School of Management. Jerome is going to go for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to ask Jim Kuchar, who I'll introduce at that point, to just give us a little bit of a response to some of Jerome's ideas, and then we'll open it up to everybody to comment and ask questions and so on. Does that sound okay? Okay, Jerome, it's all yours.
Definitely. Thank you for having me at the Social Academy today again to introduce myself, Jerome Hughes from the Community Development Law Clinic. And what I would like to sort of chat about is, exploring the possibility of social cooperatives. So let me pull my slide deck up at this point. Play from start. Can everyone see that? Great.
Yep.
So this question sort of arose for me out of some of the client matters that we were working on in the clinic. And so we had a prospective childcare cooperative, a group of low-income women who were interested in creating this childcare cooperative, which had a physical location. And because they understood that, notwithstanding that they would be bringing, their time and their attention and their own personal resources, they knew they needed sort of additional resources to both navigate the startup time that it takes for creating a cooperative, but also some of the real costs. So they were interested in creating a adjoining nonprofit to obtain sort of grant support. And this question around sort of creating an adjoining nonprofit often comes up for many small businesses that come into our clinic. They're like, not only do I want to do this, but I also want to do this. And so it sort of brings up this question for me, is like is there some possibility for us to create this overlap between 501c3 status and also cooperatives? The other context that this came up for me was just social entrepreneurs, community organizers in the community development context. They have this interest in creating, jobs for low income and disadvantaged workers. They want to provide various community focused services. And often there's this thing, okay, let me create this nonprofit, and then this nonprofit would allow me to do, this, and this, right? And so again, there was this question of like, can we sort of merge the idea of both creating a venture and creating and having 501c3 status? And so, for this discussion, I want to kind of look at, a few questions. One, what are social cooperatives broadly framed? Whether social cooperatives will qualify under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. How can we certify social cooperatives? And I'll sort of lead into that. And then what are the values and uses for social cooperatives? And I really appreciate sort of, the two conversations that have gone, before, in terms of just starting to think and sort of theorize more around this question. So one, I want to provide you a reference, and I'm going to put, I sort of worked on this as part of a law review article. And so if you could, I'm going to put a link in the chat box. I would really appreciate it if you could go there and download, just so I can have another click, even if you don't have the time to read it because it's 70 or so pages. But also, just as a disclaimer, any information provided in this presentation is not legal advice. It's informational discussion, programmatic. And so if you have any sort of, hard questions, you probably should sort of refer to an attorney respect to the legal matter. So what are social cooperatives? So we all have some definition of cooperatives, member controlled and governed, serving the needs of the members in the community, and likely distributes on the basis of patronage. But this notion of social adds some question about what additional features are we referring to? So are we referring to charitable purpose, public interest, having volunteers, relief of poverty, entity, and legal features of the entity? And so, somehow we were trying to figure out what that space is. And so, in my work, I've often sort of bracketed, the possibility of social cooperatives as being a few types, functionally, both, affordable housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, consumer purchasing cooperatives, multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and potentially some other forms that we haven't, quite sort of discussed and thought of yet. And so if we look at, there's some precedent around that, right? So if you look at the Italian context, right, they created a particular social cooperative form, and from 1991 to 2021, they were able to create over 15,000 social cooperatives employing, 480,000 people. And that's among other countries that have also done something similar. In addition, we have this sort of trajectory of work around housing cooperatives. If we look at the work around limited equity cooperative, NASCO's work around group equity cooperatives, and this sort of, this work around community land trust, which I think of community land trust as definitely multi-stakeholder cooperatives, we see this trajectory of trying to figure out this question of the nonprofit versus cooperative overlap. In addition, we have this very robust cooperative supporting nonprofit ecosystem that's been developing out and that we hope to continue to expand upon. And then we can also see the Sustainable Economy Law Center work around worker-run nonprofits. And finally, I would also note the employee stock ownership plans that sort of fall into the category of tax-exempt organization, which I'll sort of speak to a bit in a moment. And so then we sort of come back to the question of what are social cooperatives. So we can first take a sort of a branding perspective, right? And so in Professor Waterhouse Wilson's works, she sort of articulates cooperatives as social enterprises. And that's because we know that they provide sort of democracy, they provide equality, they provide these other sorts of public goods and sort of public benefits that we think are very important. And so we could take that and say, you know, cooperatives are social cooperatives as the broadest category because of the types of goods that they provide. Becoming a bit more specific, we might sort of come up with a definition specifically for social cooperatives and say social cooperatives are this, and, you know, create some certification around that. And finally, we might sort of actually define social cooperatives in legislation. And as you may know, in some states, they have some form of nonprofit cooperatives among other forms that you could sort of say broadly fit into our notions of social cooperatives. The focus of my research, you know, as I discussed before, was this sort of overlap between cooperatives and whether something could sort of fulfill the 501c3 status. And so I use the question of the 501c3 status as a starting point to get back to the question of certification. So what am I proposing here? So I want to sort of propose a preliminary framework that will sort of guide my discussion and my analysis as I sort of walk through this. And, you know, and at the center of that sort of framework is the poverty or disadvantaged status of the participants. And so I propose that sort of the primary social cooperative status is, you know, 75% of its participants sort of are classified as, you know, poor and disadvantaged. You know, which is sort of my primary category. And then as a secondary category, which is sort of arose out of our conversations, you know, around this issue of having, you know, 50% of the participants being disadvantaged, in addition to some other charitable exempt purpose fulfilled by the organization. So that's the center of the framework. But in addition to that, I would also propose that we think about how the sort of internal capital accounts of the entity works, particularly, you know, I propose a nonprofit internal capital account, which I'll talk about more, where sort of some part of the net earnings and 100% of the donations would go into. And I know, you know, in the community, we sort of think about indivisible reserves. And so this is sort of parallel to that idea. You know, third, thinking about the certification as part of classifying this entity. And then there's this question around legal status, which I don't get to specifically, particularly like the state legal statuses, because there might be multiple forms of entity that a social cooperative can actually be formed under. So I don't speak to that particularly here, but it would also be something of consideration. So again, getting back to the question, like what are social cooperatives? I'm starting from the 501c3 question, and hopefully that'll sort of open up the question around certification. So my basic analysis is whether a social cooperative would qualify as an eligible entity under 501c3 status. And so step one is, does it meet the 501c3 exempt purpose requirement? And then two, does it violate, and we don't want it to violate, but does it violate any of the 501c3 limitations, which might include the kind of non-distribution doctrines, which might include market limiting doctrines, which might also include sort of policy and political oriented doctrines. So those are the two steps that we need to make. So just to orient you a bit, when you think about where 501c3 fits, it fits under sort of the tax-exempt 501a status. And there's a broad category of organizations that fit here. As you can see here, you know, I discussed it before, employee stock ownership plans, they actually fit under the 501a. And then you have 28 varieties of 501c organizations, and then you have the sort of 501c3 subset. And the 501c3 subset is particularly important because while the entire category have tax exempt status, it's primarily the 501c3 subset, which you can also have these sort of tax deductible donation contributions, right? Which is part of the incentive, right? I would also say ESOPs have a form of a tax deductible distribution contribution as well. that comes out, but it doesn't occur in the same form as for 501c3 organizations. So that's what's sort of important. So not only do you get this tax exempt status, but you also are able to contribute tax deductible donations, whether through philanthropy or whether through individuals. So does the social cooperative meet the exempt purposes requirement? Let's look at the code, right? So again, 501A, exemption from taxation, an organization described in subsection C or D, or 401A shall be exempt from taxation. And so as you know, that's the 401A is the part where the ESOPs fall under. And then we go to 501c3. And so this is the actual statute. It's often good to read this. Any corporations, community, trust fund, or foundation organized and operated exclusively for these sort of sets of exempt purposes, right? And this language, organized and operated exclusively, has a set of doctrines attached to it. And then you get down to this part: no part of the net earnings which inured to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. And so that's part of the non-distribution limitation that I highlighted before. And so just thinking about it, what are the exempt purposes for 501c3? Again, sort of repeating what was on the previous slide: religious, charitable, scientific, etc. We're interested in the charitable and its generally accepted legal sense. And then the regulations provides a list of status that sort of fulfill this charitable, one being the relief of the poor and distress. And so this is the one that we're focusing on for purposes of this analysis. And so at this point comes my first argument, right? The exempt and charitable purpose of relief of the poor and distress should be fulfilled by social cooperatives under the proposed frameworks, right? So if I said that 75% should be poor and disadvantaged, and that the entity provides various benefits to the poor and disadvantaged, that should fulfill that exempt purpose. And so then you might ask, like, what are the benefits to the poor and distressed? So one is they provide important goods and services to their members. They would generate employment opportunities for these populations. The process of running a cooperative would develop human and intellectual capital from a governance perspective, from a management perspective, from whatever technical skills are involved. So in various types of ways, you would develop human and intellectual capital, and then you would build basic financial savings. And all of these sort of support this exempt purpose of relief of the poor and distress. Now, we sort of run into a problem here in terms of 501c3 related sort of ideas. So the traditional perspective in the code is that you would provide programs and services as relief of the poor. And so it imagines that there's a service provider and it imagines that there's a beneficiary, really separating out those two roles. Whereas in the social cooperative context, what we're sort of thinking about is that the actual organization and its structure serves as the relief in the poor of distress, where you're sort of co-creating the benefits that we described on the previous page. And so in some sense, there's a challenge here, right? Because, as, your reviewer or whatsoever you looks at your document, they were like, wait, are you providing programs and services in the traditional sense versus this sort of idea that we're saying, like, merely by having this organization and having these populations in this organization, they are getting these benefits. And so, so you might run into some challenges there. So, but, in all, I would suggest that because, we're serving, the argument here would be because we're serving this population that falls into the exempt purpose, we should sort of meet the exempt purpose requirement. So then we think we're going to think a bit more about the nonprofit internal capital count for our next question. Our next question is: do social impact cooperatives violate the non-distribution doctrine of private inurement? Right. So there are a few non-distribution doctrines that we want to pay attention to, but particularly private inurement, and that's that sort of idea that no part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. And, essentially there's this restriction from benefiting private individuals or organizations with the emphasis on insider. And so when your reviewer at the IRS gets your document, it'll be like, isn't a social cooperative similar to other types of firms, right? You have people who are on the board, people who are working inside the entity, and they would be getting the benefits. And so they would see, private inurement. So first, I want to suggest, we think about how patronage works, right? And so I found this chart that ICA Group created previously, and it shows how the net income before tax, how it would be often split, right? So you might split it between a collective net income account if you had, and then between the individual net income. And then you would take that individual net income, and the question is like, how is that distributed? And often, it would be distributed based upon the use of the firm, which might include hours work, might include sort of time allocated or some other, but it wouldn't be divided on the basis of your capital contribution, right? Which is sort of the fundamental distinction between how a cooperative works and between how sort of maybe more traditional firms work. And so in this case, we would see, the argument would be, patronage works in a particular way based upon the use of the firm. And so to take this one step further to sort of make clear this idea around the nonprofit internal capital account, this portion that we allocated here into the collective account that you might also think about as an indivisible reserves would be sort of the nonprofit sort of portion of the social cooperative, right? And the goal would be that you wouldn't pay tax on that, and then any deductible donations would go into this account. And so then the question is like, how much would go over here? We would like to make that number at like 50%, right? To suggest that we're protecting, to show that we're protecting kind of the nonprofit assets. So let's go to my second argument, right? So dealing with this question of non-distribution and private inurements. So my argument is that this should not necessarily violate these limited patronage arrangements. This 50% that's going to individuals should not violate private inurement. And so the question would be why? So one, just as a basic notion, private inurement, of course, permits a broad range of ordinary and necessary expenses, paying wages, bonuses, commissions, pensions, vendor, consultant, and contractor. As you all know, there's, all of this is going on in nonprofits. They get to do this, as much as any business. And so the standard is that the payments are reasonable and not excessive. And so, the argument here is that limited patronage based upon the time or use, should be reasonable. Like there's no expectation that someone is going to be, earning, unduly amounts, given that the patronage benefit is already split, and that it's being based upon the use of the firm. The second argument sort of arises from the basic logic of patronage under subchapter T. There's two logics. One is a price adjustment logic. The other is an agent conduit logic. And the price adjustment logic is the idea that patronage is essentially a business expense deduction for goods purchased or services provided. And then the agent conduit logic is that the cooperative is serving as the agent for the patron's resource. It's just holding the patron's resource. So the sale related to the patron's resource are not included in the cooperative's income. And so under both of these logic, technically the patronage should not be considered part of the entity's net income, and thus no private inurement. And so then the third argument, which may be more helpful because the second one was a little technical, but the third argument is that courts have already affirmed that tax-exempt organizations can provide private benefits to members of a charitable class. You have this case, industrial aid for the blind versus commissioner. You have aid to artisan. So this notion that we started off with, that we should, have this feature where 75% of the participants fall into the sort of, poor and disadvantaged class, sort of serves a purpose here because it creates this charitable class that we can say this organization is working on behalf of these populations. And according to this, patronage is actually a case law appropriate charitable benefit, right? And so those are sort of the three arguments of why I don't think why these patronage arrangements should not necessarily violate sort of the private or inurement. But then you get to reality, and even having made the case that we should both meet the exempt purpose requirement and that we should also meet, some of these not sort of violate these non-distribution limitations, particularly addressing private inurement. There's others that we'd have to consider, such as private benefit. You essentially fall into this really fuzzy space. Well, it will essentially depend on, which reviewer you have. And so having something that just provided clarity on this issue, whether it's regulation or whether it's some sort of legislative action, could be very helpful. And in the context of sort of the IRS, you're looking for a revenue ruling, you're looking for a private letter ruling, or again, some sort of legislative fix. And so part of my proposal, just to sort of put it out, would be, often we think about, okay, so how would you change 501c3? But I would actually think about changing IRC 170B1A to amend it so that it included cooperatives that are engaged in the relief of poverty and distress. Because remember, we talked about the difference between tax exemptions and the tax deductible contributions. And so essentially you would be changing the rules related to the tax deductible contributions. And by changing the rules there, it could also, feed into how the 501c3 rules are sort of understood. And so, so this is some example language that, of course, we could do more work around. So again, we get to our questions, what are cooperatives, and then what features? And I suggested this proposed framework where it's like, thinking about the poverty and disadvantage of the participants, having this nonprofit internal capital account where I could be more specific, where 50% of the net earnings go into the nonprofit internal account, where all of the donations go into that account. And then you have some certification system. So let's think about this certification system. Again, just as a reminder of what I've done this far, I've looked at the 501c3, done an analysis under 501c3 to say, like, what features might be helpful in our definition and certification process. And so then we come to the question of, how can we certify social cooperatives? And essentially it's, building upon the system that we already have in the cooperative ecosystem, right? And so it's 3 levels: the certified social cooperative, the certifying nonprofit, and then some national certification board. So if we think about what the certified social cooperative is, it's just the entity that's going to be certified. If we think about what the certifying nonprofit is, it's the range of nonprofit incubators that work with cooperative support organizations who themselves become sort of certifying nonprofits. Typically they would have some sort of 501c3 status. Often they provide services, including incubation, technical assistance, those things. These are often the things that they're already doing, right, in terms of things that we consider social cooperatives. And considerations around those certifying nonprofit, we think about representation, where they are represented in terms of region, diversity, capacity, mission alignment, those sorts of things. And then the sort of addition is just thinking about some sort of social cooperative board of federation that creates some sort of set of certification standards that certifies the certifying nonprofit. So the certifying nonprofits themselves will be sort of under a certification standard that conducts certification trainings and conferences, that has members, and again, thinking about sort of its composition in terms of diversity, representativeness, scope, and proximity to low-income populations. So that's a way that we could sort of think about a system for certifying social cooperatives. Now, the last question, what values can social cooperatives create? And we already know, like we started off with this idea that just in their very functioning, in their very organizational structure, they can provide direct benefits to the poor and distressed. This is the language, of course, of the code around this, in terms of providing important goods and services, generating employment opportunities, developing human and intellectual capital, and of course, building basic financial savings. But if we think about the logic of social cooperatives, there's like a few logics, right? So they're advancing charitable purposes and public interests. They're sort of, maybe reducing poverty, addressing poverty. There's also this logic of positive branding that often goes with nonprofit status. And there's some research around this that, organizations that are branded with social purposes, people are often willing to pay higher prices for, and things of this nature. And then there's this subsidy targeting logic where whether it's from philanthropy, whether it's through government grants, you can also imagine tax credit and subsidized loans and guarantees being sort of targeted at these forms. And then there's sort of legal and policy targeting, things that we've discussed around public procurement, right, to these types of entities. So these are sort of the logics that could drive social cooperatives. And then the use cases, as I come to the close, they could be, again, as we described earlier, they could be worker cooperatives, housing cooperatives, union cooperatives, platform cooperatives. We can imagine support in terms of the startup or incubation of these. We can also imagine conversion of these social cooperatives to just, regular cooperatives, forward or backward. And we can imagine sort of the formation of sort of a new generation of community organizations. And so these are sort of the ideas that sort of, that that sort of motivate this sort of thinking around the overlap between 501c3 status and this project that we think of as social cooperatives. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you, Jerome. Yeah, it feels like that was kind of positive and encouraging, and I get the sense that we're part of the way there. I want to ask one quick question, and then I want to go to Jim Kuchar. On certifying boards, what do you think the IRS would need to see in terms of what the certifying board is, or where it comes from, where it sits, this national board you're describing? What should that be, do you think?
Yeah, I think the certifying board would be serving a purpose. Like we need to, part of the, I guess, the argument of this research is that like there are some characteristics that might be helpful to have as social cooperatives if we want them to get 501c3 status, which we don't know how long that process is. And so as we sort of come together to think about, we might want a certifying board to hold, like the core of what we call a social cooperative. So that, as we move toward, the potential of getting 501c3 status, that's how, because, another approach is like, we just let everything be a social cooperative. And then, that might make it more difficult for us to kind of fit into the 501c3 framework. So part of the certifying board would be to sort of to hold, for the community to come together and say, maybe this should be a social cooperative, and then maybe these other things should be social cooperative, particularly for the purpose of like, if we want this to, to eventually have, to have 501c3 status. So
Yeah, that's good. We've got some good questions coming in the chat, but I want to go ahead and introduce Jim Kuchar, and then we're going to come back to those. So keep posting your questions and comments. They're very good. Dr. Jim Kuchar is an associate professor of social innovation in the Graduate School of the University of Maryland at Baltimore. He is an award-winning teacher and internationally recognized thought leader in social entrepreneurship, and the lead author of Social Entrepreneurship, a practice-based approach to social innovation. He got his PhD at the University of Baltimore in public administration and an MBA from its Merrick School of Business. Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Elias. Thanks, everybody. Hi. Jerome, I'm exhausted. That was a lot, man. Thank you.
That's great. Yep.
So I take a very practice-based approach to all this. I teach social entrepreneurship. I've been a social entrepreneur multiple times. And I think I have two thoughts, and they really are just thoughts. The first is regarding the Internal Revenue Service in general. And I think that particularly in the quote unquote nonprofit industrial complex, there is this notion that the IRS is scrutinizing every comma and semicolon of every application. And I just think from a practical standpoint, that's not correct, particularly when you look at the decimation of the agency that happened under a previous presidential administration who will go nameless. So I think there's sort of, this may not be quite as, I'm getting a weird message asking me to confirm my speaking language. Huh, okay, I am speaking English. I think. I know it's got a Baltimore accent, so maybe it's not.
Okay.
Anyway, and then also just in terms of filing, with the IRS, getting a tax status determination letter takes a lot of time and takes a lot of money. So from a practical standpoint, I think, yes, is this something that should happen? Yeah. Is this a status change that needs to happen? Yeah. Will it ever happen in the US? I have my doubts for a lot of reasons that get to what the American economic system is founded on. But there's a couple of really practical solutions that sort of, in my opinion, negate the necessity for a lot of this. And one is to use a fiscal sponsor arrangement, which for those of you that may not know very quickly, fiscal sponsorship allows you to effectively rent a 501c3 status from any other agency. There are some issues around that. There's a great book by a guy by the name of Greg Colvin on how to do it right. It's literally called Fiscal Sponsorship: 6 Ways to Do It Right. The other one is that you can form a subsidiary entity and have a nonprofit parent and a for-profit subsidiary. And in that for-profit subsidiary, you could organize the for-profit subsidiary as a cooperative quite easily. So those are just a couple of things that I think might be quicker answers. And then from there, then perhaps once that happens and you get enough folks that are actually running as social cooperatives, whether they're legally organized as such or not, you could then sort of stand up and say, okay, now we need the revolution because we've got these, several hundred, several thousand entities that are kind of up there and running and making that happen. So that's sort of my thoughts from the practitioner's chair.
All right, very good. Should we go through some of the questions in the chat, which will bear on what we just heard also? Ariana, would you like to ask her question so I don't misstate it and haven't misunderstood it? Can you do that?
I actually like the way that Kermit phrased it. I think we're asking a very similar question about the
Yep.
definitions of disadvantage, poverty, and how those definitions
Yeah.
move away from self-empowerment and more toward charity, and that continues to oppress us.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm curious how Jerem's respond to Jim.
Yeah,
have
I mean,
something?
yeah,
Yeah.
I would just say like the language in the code is, of course, created in a particular context in time, and is not necessarily how we might talk about the populations that we work with for these purposes. And I definitely hear that and understand that concern. I do think that definition that is in the code is broad enough and includes, a number of different things, in addition to poverty that sort of represents, the challenge of being under-resourced, the challenge of, trying to make ends meet, those sorts of things, which we understand as pressing concerns. But I do understand that just the concern about the language of the code and how to navigate that as, if we were going to create a social cooperative under one of these frameworks. I think, just thinking about Jim's sort of approach around the fiscal sponsorship arrangement and renting the 501c3 status, and also doing the subsidiary entity. I mean, I think in practicality, that's what we're doing right now, right? I think that's what the community of practitioners are, innovating around in various sorts of ways, to build out this work. And I think this concept, emerges as sort of builds off what people are already doing. And part of the case here is it might be helpful to have a more generalized 501c3 status that's not merely attached to a particular organization. Because one of the things, as I think about that childcare cooperative, they had to attach themselves to a nonprofit, and they got into sort of the administrative related issues of dealing with a particular, dealing with that particular nonprofit. And, they had to negotiate things from scratch. And so I think there's a lot of that going on, and, some groups do it really well, and some groups are trying to figure it out in practice. And so the question of like how we build out the infrastructure to support that, to a broader set of nonprofits that might be sort of mission aligned, is important. And so I think part of the idea of this certification is saying, hey, we don't need to necessarily start with a change of law to do it, but it may be helpful for us to, come together, as a community to sort of think about, the way that we do that, right? And have a conversation about it. Even if the community decides, hey, we don't necessarily need a formal social cooperative to do this, but here are ways that we could do this in terms of this fiscal sponsorship arrangement. Here are some standards that we might want to have around this, or subsidiary entities. Here's some standards that we might want to have around this. So I think this is part of the conversation.
Elias, there's a question in the chat that was posted that I put a quick answer to, that I'd like to stretch out a little bit more. And it was about whether social enterprises are always organized as for-profit or nonprofit. And I think there's a bigger strategic question that often gets lost in this conversation. And that is that 501c3 is a tax status, not an operating model. It's okay. And one of the things that I work very hard on with the folks that I teach and the folks that I coach is figure out what you want to be first, and then decide how you're going to structure it legally and from a tax standpoint, right? So some of this, I think, also has to get inverted in the conversation to say, what do you want to do and what's the best way to fund that and organize that? And then decide what your legal status and your tax status are. And I think sometimes we get those flipped.
Yep. I want to see if I can quickly respond to Marion's question, and then if someone else has a thought on this, that's fine. She was asking about, let me find it here again. In terms of the disadvantaged communities, are we talking about the employees, or are we talking about the community they serve? And I think that's a little bit confusing because there's more than one kind of social co-op. In Italy, there are two big ones. So one kind would be, essentially a business, really, in many ways. But the employees are, let's say, taking Jerome's number, 75% from a neighborhood, an area which is low income. And so that's one model. There's also another model where you might be working, or rather, you might be hiring people who have certain kinds of disabilities. And so they are automatically in that category, given that personal situation. So there are a couple of ways of looking at what disadvantaged means. And, whether, well, I hope that clarifies it just a little bit. In other words, there's more than one kind of audience or customer base you could be serving, and more than one kind of workforce you could be employing. Anyone else have any thoughts on that, or we have more questions to?
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Elias. I think somebody else also mentioned later, like, would that mean that the co-op can't do too well because then the people who are, let's say, poor or considered poor based on their income would then build wealth and therefore no longer be eligible to be considered, distressed or poor?
Min-Sun, would you like to respond to that? What happens if you're too successful?
Well, actually, that would be great if they no longer, right?
It's like a nonprofit.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't get to keep it.
Right, absolutely. But I want to actually go back to sort of Jim's comment and some of the chat's comments about the fiscal sponsorship. Actually, my organization, RMUC, is running into exactly the problem that I want to address. We have incubated many different cooperatives under RMUC. But what is the problem is that each co-op may need a significant capital. So let's say Mushroom Cooperative, we just have to get a $250,000 loan that will come to RMUC, and that is actually a final responsibility party. And then we are gonna switch channels and then transfer over to the co-op. How about driver's co-op? It needs another $500,000 to develop the app. So then, and I'm just giving examples of so many different co-op. They may need a significant capital, but as a nonprofit, this is actually a problem because it gets too chaotic and much more difficult to just transfer money to those cooperatives, especially being a nonprofit. So from the perspective of being a co-op, wouldn't it be nice that actually that co-op, Mushroom Co-op, can become also a nonprofit status so that they could actually get a grant directly without going through a co-op incubation organization such as ours. So trying to figure out what actually works best for these cooperatives. And I think that is a power of creating a separate category of a social cooperative. I do believe that this is very different from B Corp. And some people said, well, how about B Corp? We have a lot of B Corp. But as Jerome said, we can actually specialize or define what this social cooperative could be. You could be actually starting from like 75% of the people being coming from sort of the poor and disadvantaged community. I think that could be actually very powerful tools to really lift the marginalized community first before anybody else. Just using this social cooperative. That's how I see it necessary. Yeah, of course, we have a B Corp. Yes, there are subsidiary businesses as they can be formed under nonprofit. However, the business model is cooperative. That's why I think that we do need a separate legal.
And so 2 quick points. I'm not suggesting we don't. I'm simply saying that it's a very steep mountain to climb that's going to take a long time and a lot of determined people, many of whom are on this call, so good on you. But I do think there's other solutions in the interim. But the other thing I want to say just very quickly and geeking out for a second is B Corp is not a legal status. B Corp is a designation provided by B Lab. Benefit Corporation, Maryland being the first state to do that, is a legal status. So there is a minor distinction that you need to make there. And I think we use those terms interchangeably to our detriment. But yeah, does it need to happen? Yeah, a lot of things need to happen. But will it? I frankly have my doubts.
I want to respond quickly to Santiago, who says, I'd like to hear more about what problem is solved by this entity. It seems like its appeal is that it can receive tax deductible contributions while sharing profits with employees. Is there more? Yeah, and the more has to do with the services, the care. What's remarkable about social co-ops in Italy, Quebec, South Korea, is that they are multi-stakeholder, they're bottom-up, they're community-led, and the care is decided upon, devised, and delivered by all the different members of the co-op. Multiple memberships. We haven't gone into this yet, really. Memberships can include volunteers, donors, community members, family members, and members of local government, which is often where the funding is coming from. So what happens in reality, according to the data, is that when you have those people at the table all together creating the care, according to the people receiving it and the people offering it, it's the highest quality social care practically you can measure. So the satisfaction numbers are very high for this kind of arrangement. It's clearly not a simple thing to do, but if you can do it, whether this is elder care, child care, disabled care, it's very impactful and very grounded in an immediate community. So that's the other big advantage here. This isn't just like a normal business. It is a very community-focused, relational business with room in its operating procedures for that relationality. It's not all about efficiency. It's about the quality of the care delivered. That's a big deal, particularly in the American context at this moment.
I think one of the questions is just sort of around why do we need something like this other than the kind of the tax exemption or getting the tax deductible contributions. It's interesting because previously ESOPs weren't a legally authorized form, and once they created it and provided these incentives around it, it created this search process, right? So entrepreneurs who are thinking about I need to sell my business, let me use an ESOP. They put in place an ESOP, thinking it was just like a tool, and all of a sudden the workers, say, hey, we got an ESOP here. We want to take control of what's going on, and became much more engaged and much more involved, wanted to know what was going on. And so there is this sort of, the forms that you use have some impact on, how people sort of operate, right? And so having a social impact cooperative that has 501c3 status would actually create this, this search process among, a broader population of these social entrepreneurs that I talked about, these community organizers, like, hey, instead of creating a traditional nonprofit, maybe we create this that both creates opportunities. We learn more about like how to work together democratically, cooperatively, and sort of it sort of generates those values from that sort of learning and search process. The other thing is, like, if you have this entity as a form, it also allows you to do, what I thought of as sort of legal targeting, where you might, and I think Minson has talked about this in terms of, public, allowing it to get certain types of preferred procurement, among other things, right? And so that could be an important sort of effect of it as well. And then on the question of like what happens when it does well, I mean, I think we can, of course, there would be some point where you think the unrelated business income tax, if you move from 75% and maybe move down to 55 or 45, like what would that do? And maybe the unrelated business income tax would become more important. And so, part of the idea is maybe we want to convert it, from a nonprofit status, to a more traditional cooperative status of some type, right? Losing the 501c3 sort of component of it. But and part of what we have to think about is like, given that you have this nonprofit internal capital account, like how do you sort of transition that, because that's the nonprofit portion of the organization. How do you transition that sort of out of the organization? And you would imagine at the point that it's becoming successful, it's easier for it to get a loan of some type and to work with its certifying nonprofit to transition those assets to some other nonprofit or a social cooperative. So,
Jerome, a quick question. Marian and I both noticed you're using the term social impact cooperative, when we both thought that was a little more expressive of what this is. Is that your term, or did you come across it somewhere?
Yeah, so in the paper that I wrote, I started off calling it social cooperatives, and Clark Arrington, who's on the call, said, "Hey, you should probably call it social impact cooperative." And I was like, "Oh, that makes sense." So I called it that.
Very good. Okay, let's see if we have other questions here.
I have a question. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead.
I have done everything that Jim said. We are registered as a co-op, but we are a teacher cooperative. So we definitely not ever going to be for profit or giving profit to our workers and stuff like that. So before this social cooperative stuff came up, we were planning to open up a nonprofit to be wing of this cooperative so we can apply for grants. And right now, we use one of our schools, which is a nonprofit, as a fiscal sponsor of our co-op. But this is nothing but headache. It's a can of worm. It's so much work that I am not willing to do that. And I am so much pro this social cooperative. And Minson, if you need help on this and to take it to legislation, I will be one of them that would be really helping you, because I have done everything Jim said and it's just kind of worm. I cannot deal with this anymore. It's just so much, so much bins that, and I'm not saying, Jim, that you probably offered these things in not because we don't have, in lieu of not having a social cooperative, and those are just fine, and we are doing that. But it's so ineffective and efficient that I just do not want to deal with it anymore. And I rather, and Minsan, my question to you, how far are we in Colorado trying to do this, or are we very far,
We are just starting to, share this so that we could actually change policy at the state levels. And I think Colorado is a right state and great state to pass some new policy, around social cooperatives.
Roy, I just want to chime in on, number one, I feel your pain. I had a social enterprise startup that we had through a friendly relationship with a separate 501c that was our fiscal sponsor. There are purpose-built fiscal sponsor organizations. I put in the chat the website for the National Network of Fiscal Sponsors. And the folks that do it professionally can be a better and less annoying solution. So sometimes it does depend on who your fiscal sponsor is. But yes, it's not I'm not trying to say that this is the answer and we don't need this other effort. I'm just trying to get things done in the meantime. But I feel your pain. It can be hard.
I guess, can I ask?
Sure.
I'm trying to understand the difference between using a fiscal sponsor and using the nonprofit organization already that exists. So we're Collective Remake in LA, and we're building, doing cooperative education with development with people in neighborhoods impacted by high rates of incarceration. We were just given a big grant by the county to support an urban garden and beautification project we've been working on for a couple of years. So I would deem that a social cooperative until it's actually a functioning business with a profit line item. Is it not just a project of the nonprofit? And paying guys stipends and stuff like that. And if the leadership emerges that can handle the independent cooperative, that would be the ultimate goal. But how can this project stay attached to the nonprofit and continue to get nonprofit funds for its startup costs? And then I guess it is when it starts making a profit and you're actually paying people on a, or earning a wage as worker owner. I guess that's where the worker ownership is what's.
So a 501c3 registered organization can earn as much money as it wants. The only thing it can't do, as Jerome pointed out, is distribute it to individual shareholders. So, you know, earning a profit is sort of a misnomer in this whole world. I mean, personally, I don't like the phrase nonprofit in general because it describes what you don't do, which is kind of dumb. But you know, there's a lot of wrinkles in this, and individual cases can get very complicated. But you can earn money and not jeopardize your tax status, particularly if it's related to your mission.
Yeah. I want to ask Daniel if he has some thoughts on this because he's a published author on this subject, and I'd love to know what he's thinking. Daniel, are you there?
Hi, I prefer to speak in Spanish because I express better. So I.
Oh, okay.
Entonces, en España, precisamente, comentando la formación o cómo están compuestas estas cooperativas sociales, tanto en España como en Italia, por ejemplo, encontramos que no únicamente tienen que estar compuestas por socios o por personas con algún tipo de dificultad o discapacidad, sino que también es posible que estas cooperativas a lo mejor presten servicios sociales no atendidos correctamente por el mercado, como podría ser una cooperativa de educación o una cooperativa de sanidad, de salud. Entonces, por ejemplo, la cooperativa de la que hablaba anteriormente el anterior interviniente sí que sería considerada en España o en Italia como una cooperativa social. Y con respecto a la distribución de beneficios, sí que se observan en las distintas legislaciones que he estudiado distintos modelos. He visto legislaciones que permiten la distribución de beneficios entre los socios de las cooperativas sociales. Precisamente suelen ser esas cooperativas que están conformadas mayoritariamente por personas con discapacidad o con algún tipo de dificultad, de tal forma que al distribuir los beneficios va directamente los beneficios a esas personas con dificultades y, bueno, pues toman alguna ventaja de esos beneficios. En cambio, las cooperativas que no están compuestas por personas con discapacidad, en la mayoría de las leyes se prohíbe la distribución de beneficios. Y en España habría que señalar que esta distribución de beneficios, bueno, se prohíbe de manera más agravada, dado que se prohíbe la distribución tanto directa como indirecta, es decir, al finalizar el ejercicio económico no se pueden distribuir beneficios, pero es que además los salarios de los trabajadores encuentran un tope máximo que van a poder cobrar. de tal forma que los trabajadores tampoco de esa forma indirecta puedan recibir esos salarios, al igual que tampoco se permite, por ejemplo, pagarle un salario a los miembros de la junta directiva bueno, tampoco se permite en caso de que las aportaciones al capital social devengan algún tipo de interés, se prohíbe que devenguen más de un 6%. O sea que al final no se busca únicamente la distribución directa, sino también la distribución indirecta de beneficios.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's see, Matthew Epperson is not with us, but he sent in a question. He's just curious about the potential hybridity of for-profit, nonprofit models as a legal structure, or he says, or even just for-profit in the sense of an LCA. Any thoughts on that? Minson, do you have a thought on that?
Yes, Linda is here. She's actually a attorney in Colorado. So
That's
maybe Linda, do you want to actually say something about what LCA does here in Colorado? So LCA is a limited cooperative associations that allows the investors to be part of the cooperative. Linda, would you like to answer?
Sure. An LCA has a opportunity to be taxed as either a partnership or as a subchapter T cooperative corporation. And it has the same limitations, but Colorado is an interesting state because we have several different ways you can form a co-op through an LLC, through this co-op LCA, the Limited Cooperative Association, or through a co-op corporation. In our particular co-op corporation statutes, you can also elect to be a nonprofit cooperative corporation. So for me, the issue is not the legal status. You can be a nonprofit cooperative in Colorado. It's more the tax status. And what is the benefit to the people that are forming the co-op? If they're going to elect to be a nonprofit, then, as we all know, the tax code does not allow nonprofits to share net profits with its members. So that's the issue that I'm coming across with this particular idea of a social enterprise. Our firm is known as a social enterprise law firm. We form social enterprises all over the place. But that tax issue, has anyone talked to a CPA or a tax attorney about combining a nonprofit and a for-profit subchapter T into or revising either the nonprofit or a subchapter T to create this kind of entity, because that's where it's going to have to happen, not so much the legal status, is my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's the question, you know, that we sort of thought about is like, what is considered private inurement, and whether, you know, the sort of patronage arrangement that you see in terms of, you know, sharing, you know, like those net earnings on the basis of you know, whatever the hours or some other sort of patronage arrangement would be considered private inurement. And I think, you know, the typical answer would be yes. I think that's the starting point. But I do think that because there is, you know, there is case law among other that says like you can share benefits with the charitable class. I think that's what's partly making the social cooperative idea, you know, as sort of as proposed under the framework I talked about earlier, maybe unique because you can share it with the charitable class, you know, bounded in certain ways. And so, you know, so that would be the question, and that would be something that, again, I think my sort of thinking is that you would need something to provide legal clarity, whether a revenue ruling or legislation to enable it. It wouldn't be just, you know, something, you know, that would necessarily naturally occur. I think on the question of hybridity, I mean, I think hybridity is sort of the space that entities are in, right? So if we think about the limited liability company, that wasn't an entity, necessarily in the 60s, right? And if, the places that were experimenting with limited partnerships of various types, like often, they were classified as, for federal taxation purposes as C corporations, right? And so there was this evolution of like, okay, we need to get some entity that has limited liability status, but then can have this pass through that we associate with partnerships. And so over time, both subchapter K law and sort of, law associated with limited liability companies, among other types of partnerships, sort of evolved in this place that allowed for this entity that wasn't previously enabled, right? And so I think that's partly what we, continue to do as part of the democratic process, is to figure out, what sort of legal forms serve the needs that we have. And maybe the traditional nonprofit, where it imagines that the client and the services are separate, is not the best form. Maybe we don't want to do a public enterprise where you have traditional owners and, investors who can invest in it, but maybe something, what we're talking about, where the charitable class both has a, governance and management role, and actually, the benefit is created inside of the entity, is, a good model. And, as Jim said, they're like, people are kind of doing this, right, under fiscal sponsorship and other sort of related arrangements, right? And so maybe it's something that we want to formalize, at the level of national law, so that places that may not have as good entity formation sort of ideas as sort of Colorado, or among other places, so that they can have this form available to to do the work that they want to do. So
I see Mary Sutton has her hand up.
Yeah, so, I'm thinking the justification for nonprofits not being able to distribute profits is assuming that most of those dollars at the end of the year, came from tax dollars and foundations and government entities. But if the profit is coming from a project of the nonprofit, and part of the project is to pay out the profits within that project, they're not necessarily a profit of the nonprofit, but they're part of that project. So that those aren't tax dollars, and how you want to distribute within that project seems to me, I don't know, it's like what you guys are talking about, it's all kind of open, but that seems justified to me.
If you're generating revenue that's related to your mission, then that's one thing. You're still not taking those profits and handing them off to individual employees. You're still plowing them back into the organization. And if you're plowing it back into the organization, then you keep your nonprofit status, right?
There's also another back door on this, which is you can just pay people salaries.
Yeah.
You can pay them massive salaries and not run any risk of jeopardizing your tax status, and distribute it that way. It literally is only to quote unquote shareholders, in the same way that you would own stock in a public corporation.
Yeah.
If you are a listed stockholder of an entity and you are trying to maintain your charitable status, then that's when the IRS can climb up your chimney.
Let me see if I can do one more quick question, and then we should probably wrap up. Kermit's asking if co-ops can be 501c3s. My answer is, somebody else correct me if I'm wrong. No, but we're not talking about co-ops. We're talking about social co-ops. So that's a different thing. That's the reason for this whole 501c3 conversation that Jerome has started us out on. This is not like just starting a bakery. You're doing something different. You're doing something for community benefit, very explicitly, particularly in terms of social care. And so that is why the 501c3 model feels like it could be a good way of making a start on creating the model we need, whether that's the final version or not. But that's why we're looking at the nonprofit status. Anybody else? We should probably wind up then. Isn't this fun? We have a lot of things to figure out here. These are all good problems, I think. Thank you, Thank you, everyone. Next week, we're back to the regular time. That's 3 p.m. Eastern. So do remember that. And thanks very much, Jerome, Jim. That was great. This will be recorded and we'll keep rolling.
If I may, thank you, Elias, for the opportunity.
Thank
We
you.
do teach this stuff, folks. So I put my email in the chat. So if anybody wants to find
Yeah,
out more
good.
about that, please
That's
feel
right.
free to find me.
Great. Thanks. Bye, everyone. See
Definitely.
you
Thanks
next
so
time.
much for having me.
Thank you
Take care.
so much.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jerome.
Bye. Thank you, Jerome.
Bye-bye.